everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Faitheism Project podcast. My name is Alan Katz. I've always been grateful to Hebrew School for making me the atheist that I am today.
And my name is Randy Lovejoy, and I am a pastor who has stepped outside of the church to help people go deeper inside of the faith. And it is good to be with you, Alan, yet again for another conversation.
Always a pleasure, Randy. Today we're talking about something that I think is so intriguing. I pitched the idea to you a couple of weeks ago, and of course your first question was the obvious question: what are you talking about?
That's right.
But somehow the topic got under your skin.
Oh yeah. It's got lots of possibilities.
And hopefully the subject will get under our audience's skin too. We're asking the question today: is Christianity a hyperobject?
So you theologians out there, you need to get started on this if you haven't already. This is something.
I'm going to read our intro just because it kind of
go for it. Yeah.
It just kind of hits it. So, all right. Climate change, nuclear weapons, evolution. These things are all what self-described environmental philosopher Timothy Morton, the Rita Shea Guffey Chair in English at Rice University, calls hyperobjects, a term he coined to describe entities of such vast temporal and spatial dimensions that they defeat traditional ideas about what a thing is in the first place. A very big idea about very big things. A big idea about how to think about these very big things. In his book, Hyperobjects, Professor Morton suggests that the end of the world has already occurred in the sense that concepts such as world, nature, and even environment are no longer a meaningful horizon against which human events take place, unquote. Old ways of thinking about these things are proving inadequate to the task. Consequently, our solutions to these problems fail. To overcome this strain on our normal ways of reasoning, Morton argues, we must reinvent how we think about things as massive as hyperobjects. Okay, fair enough. Now let's ask a question. Considering things of such vast temporal and spatial dimension that they defeat traditional ideas about what a thing is in the first place, couldn't Christianity fit that description? Whatever traditional ideas our culture had or has had about Christianity, hasn't Christianity over its history overrun those borders repeatedly? 2,000 plus years into the Christian experiment, why is there so much profound disagreement amongst Christians as to what Christianity is, or even who Jesus was, and if that even matters? Now that we're thinking about it, hey, is spirituality a hyperobject? Is religious faith itself one? Hey, let's start talking. That's provided, of course, that we can fully wrap our minds around the topic.
And I think to ground it a little bit, the topic itself, the term, I thought it was interesting that it came from a song by Bjork, Hyper Ballad. That's what got Timothy Morton coining the phrase, though it's apparently as in hyphenated form, it's been used in computer science for a while. But what he was meaning by it, apparently he was inspired by Bjork. So I don't know why, but I love that. I think that's pretty interesting.
I think he actually worked on a project with her too.
Oh, did he really? I missed that part. Oh,
yeah, I believe and then they actually worked together on something.
Okay. All right. Yeah. She actually is in a song that my son just shared with me, Lucas. It was on a previous conversation with John Tavener, who's a British composer. But she's actually singing in Latin and English, Lord have mercy on me, for 15 minutes in this John Tavener composition. So she's a hyperobject right there. Just the way she works and the way her brain works. And she's just in so many ways, just outside of the box. So at least in a definition of that sense, she's definitely out there. But here's the thing that really fascinated me when you talked about hyperobject, and then you said, what if Christianity is a hyperobject?
Right.
here's one thing that's just interesting, just to try to kick it off, maybe. There's 4 gospels about Jesus, right? The first one, probably the earliest one, was the Gospel of Mark. It begins the story of Jesus just before he begins his public ministry. Okay. And that's the story it tells. Then you've got the Gospel of Luke, which starts the story just before the birth of Jesus. So you've got a wider framework. Then you've got Matthew, which starts with a genealogy from Abraham all the way to Jesus, before Jesus' story. So it like expands all the way to like Genesis 12 with Abraham, taking this journey on faith, but with this God that he doesn't know, that who said he's going to bless him, right? So it's within even wider framework. But then the latest gospel, the Gospel of John, goes even further than that. And it starts this way. Many people are familiar with it. In the beginning was the Word, capital W, which was a philosophical term as well, but he's using that for Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. That's the beginning of John's gospel. So you see this progression.
It's like John was auditioning to be a hyperobject.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because John decides, all right, if I'm going to tell the story of Jesus, I've actually got to go back to creation. It's not even enough to start in Genesis 12 with Abraham. We're going to start right at the beginning and even kind of parrot the beginning of Genesis 1 with the start of the gospel about Jesus. But the idea that I wanted to highlight there is it's just, you see this expansion of the concept of who was this guy from Nazareth, the little town of Nazareth, who was this guy? And it actually expands out that it's like they see, and other passages of the Bible see Jesus as this hyper object that's well beyond an individual, even well beyond human history, which seems kind of crazy, but is totally relevant to what we're talking about here.
My son and I were talking yesterday, because when I told him what we were going to talk about, he just got fascinated. He finds the idea of hyperobjects very compelling, and we got into a conversation, and I forget what exactly motivated it, but we suddenly said to ourselves, well, wouldn't the cross itself be a kind of hyperobject? Mm-hmm. Because it starts as one thing. I mean, really, it was an execution device.
That's right.
It was, like the guillotine or a firing squad or lethal injection.
Electric chair, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So really, it starts as one thing, and then it becomes the symbol for an entire faith, but it also becomes used as a symbol for a lot of other things that the faith is attempting to do or use its power to accomplish. And suddenly
it even becomes the scene of the switch from, the way we used to talk about all time with the BC, before Christ, and the AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. You've got this, the cross is after AD, but it becomes a part of that whole division of all time by, certain parts of the planet on the basis of this story. So, I think it's a great candidate for this kind of concept and idea.
You can have a cross, being in a church, and you can have a cross be on a crusader's chest.
Yeah. Or somebody dancing, at a nightclub, and they've got cool jewelry with a diamond encrusted cross around their neck, and you're like, so what's the symbol there? What's the meaning at this point? It's definitely, and I think that's one of the things I really liked about the concept of hyperobject is it's something that we as humans can't control. Yes. I think it's those things that work outside of us, those things that are beyond our perception. I thought that was kind of fascinating. It's where you're starting to recognize that there are other things in the world that exist, whether we notice them or not, whether we measure them or not, whether we interact with them or not, they're out there, they exist, they have a life of their own. And at least, you know, as I was reading it, it took me back to, I had a little Wittgenstein period where I was very into his stuff and trying to understand.
Did you?
That's right. That's right. My Wittgenstein period. I was never too much into the previous Wittgenstein. It was always the philosophical investigations after he had his big
later Wittgenstein, the early Wittgenstein. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. But you know, one of the things he was really trying to react against, this solipsism, kind of this idea that it's only what's in our mind, or in my mind really, is all I can be sure exists, you know, which kind of came from, you know, Descartes' kind of his prayerful meditation, trying to find what was absolutely undoubtable. And he went in, you know, instead of out, he went in. And so then you've got this view where it's like, there was, I mean, a strong philosophical point of view where it's like, all that we really know about is what's going on in our minds. And then even this idea that our identity is this stuff that's going on in our brains, like the synapses firing, that's us, you know, which in a way is kind of a weird idea. You know, it's like, yeah, but I inhabit a body, and I'm in a family, and I'm in a community, and I'm in a country, and I'm on a planet, I'm in the galaxy. You know, there's all these other connections that suddenly, well, we're not sure if they exist. And so one of the things I love about the hyperobject idea is it's almost like turning that around and saying, okay, rather than going in, let's go out to the max and see what's out there outside of us and beyond us, you know?
It's the scale.
Yeah.
It is pulling that camera out to perhaps, because we don't know, but the widest possible perspective on a subject to try to grasp what it even is.
Right. And it's, you know, it's I think a more humble recognition that we're part of a massive thing, whatever all of this is, and that we're intertwined in all of it, and we're engaged in all of it, and we can't remove ourselves from it either, you know, which is another thing. You know, I think that's something else we've had to learn. But to me, that, you know, as we started our conversation a couple of weeks ago, you know, with the pandemic, for example, it really strikes me that our leaders,
another hyperobject.
Yeah, and they really messed up by assuming it was something that we humans could control if we just had the right approach or the right rules or the right technology. But you're actually, you know, that's actually misunderstanding the pandemic. By its nature, it's this thing we're not in control of. It's this thing that runs on its own without asking our permission or without getting a visa or whatever. And you know, I think if our leaders in all of the countries around the world had started with a more humble approach of saying, wow, this is a really big thing, but we're going to do our best to limit the damage, rather than kind of saying, we're going to get this done, we're going to handle it, and it's going to be over. And it's like, well, you can't really promise that in a world where you acknowledge that kind of hyperobject. It you know, because it reduces our ability to control things. That doesn't mean, again, that we can't, you know, deal with it, but it's just to promise somebody it can be handled is like a major leadership mistake.
Well, it's a total misunderstanding of a thing that's so fluid that it can change so profoundly that whatever defenses you have put up are pretty much useless in a heartbeat, in a single generation, which is a momentary.
And all we can deal with is what's actually, you know, what's in front of us and what's there. But the fact is, the virus mutates and we don't control the mutation. So, you know, we have to be adaptive. It's not like one solution and we're done. It's like, no, this is something we're going to have to figure out how to adaptively engage this thing as it moves forward, you know, and to me, that's going to be an essential skill that our world is going to have to develop, because, you know, as we've said already with the climate, I mean, that's obviously changing. So and how much we can affect or stop the change at this point. I mean, stop it. How much we can like have the right policies so that we'll keep it where it is. Well, we're probably already past that point anyway, but we need to approach this as a thing. This is way bigger than us, but how do we adapt to this thing and deal with this thing to reduce the threat that it is?
What Morton himself writes, there's an essay that he has.
Yeah, because this is right in line with his area of study, right? I mean, he's focused on the climate as a key part of this whole thing, right?
Well, he's an English professor.
Yeah, but which I like that. I thought that was kind of interesting.
But he considers himself an environmental philosopher. And so he has pulled together all these different disciplines as part of, yes, there are sciences, but he's not so much engaged in the science itself as how to think about the science, because that's really the question that he's asking. Are we thinking about these things the right way? And he says, you can't know things directly. You can only know data. That's the foundation of modern science. Cause and effect aren't things that churn away underneath other things. They are inferences that we make about patterns we see in data.
Yeah.
And yes, sometimes we lose sight of what it is that we know and what it is that we don't know and why it is we think we know it.
And it's, I think we imagine that once we come up with a pattern in the data, then we've handled it. Yes. But it's multi-layered as well. It's like, okay, let's do this, but there may very well be some other things going on that are going to be impacted as a result. I think of like the wind turbines. It's kind of like that's a solution to one problem, but then suddenly a lot of times they can be in places where birds and or insects are, get killed by that. And it's like, okay, so now we need to solve that, and it's just that multi-layered. You've got to kind of recognize that, okay, this is a problem, this is a solution, but it's within a much wider web of interactions of things that are going on that make it more complicated. Again, that's not to throw our hands up and say, well, then we can't do anything, but it's to say, let's be wise and strategic as we try to solve this problem and see that it's part of something much bigger,
In another part of this essay that he wrote in the, where did he write this? It's in the, I've got it right here. Silly me. I'm more prepared than I realize. Silly me, if I could just find my...
Your preparedness is a hyperobject because it's greater than you. It's more than you can control.
And yet strangely not. There it is. I put it was easier than I thought. Which he wrote for the High Country News back in 2015. But like I said, we will link to that.
Yeah.
In the he's quoting Kant. In the piece, he says, Kant argues there is a gap between what a thing is and how it appears that can't be reduced no matter how hard we try. We can't locate this gap anywhere on or inside a thing. It is a transcendental gap.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that takes us back to the mystery and awe that really has been a touchstone for a lot of our conversations. And just that we find ourselves in an environment where, even our perception of things, it's limited, and we can perceive certain things and, yet, we can't pin it down,
as we've discussed here on quite a few occasions, the equipment with which our model is born all we can see is available light. We can't see X-ray light. We can't see gamma ray. There's all kinds of light spectra that we cannot see, filled with information.
And that's just one of the senses too, because we could say this with every sense,
sounds,
all of them,
smell, everything. There's all kinds of information that flies by us constantly that we are oblivious that it exists. We're completely oblivious of it. Information that
the way that we think, we filter out stuff so that we can focus. We filter things out, which might actually be some important information, but because of our assumptions and our approach, it's filtered out and we miss it, you know?
The simple fact is we don't know all there is to know. We probably don't even know what there is to know. Never mind all there is to know,
Right,
what
right.
there is to know, simply because we haven't the equipment to see it and process it. Now we can create equipment that can see X-rays and
Which
see
is
gamma
amazing.
rays.
I mean, that's
Yeah,
amazing in
yes.
itself.
So we've figured out how to locate and see and hear some of the information that we can't naturally access. But there's, I'm sure there's lots of other stuff that we are oblivious to, that we're oblivious
Yes.
of how oblivious we are of it. It wouldn't shock me that at some point we'll discover that consciousness itself is far deeper and more complex and accessible.
Yeah, I like one of the ways that Wittgenstein talked about it was it was basically this idea of like, why would we think that just what's going on in the individual head is consciousness? That it's locked in here in a way no one else can get into it unless I speak it in words or something. That's a really narrow view of what's actually going on when we're talking together. That there's a lot more going on here than just what's firing in my head or the words I'm using,
or what you are conscious
yes,
that you're conscious of, because
right.
There's all kinds of autonomic stuff that happens whether you're aware that it's happening or not, that your body regulates and does and takes care of, and it makes decisions, and it does things.
Thankfully, because otherwise, I'd never get beyond. It's kind of like if I had to think about buttoning my shirt each morning, it would take me forever. But there's, much less my heart beating throughout the day and night. Thankfully, that's on auto mode. So yeah, I mean that's just part of that the big word ontology. But I mean that's the part of what it means to be human. And that's okay, that's okay.
In a sense, isn't the whole idea of me a kind of hyperobject? Because while I might think I know what me is, there's an awful lot of me that seems to control me in ways that I can't control.
Well, and just the concept of the individual, that's something, I am sure that people from many other cultures and places and times, if they were able to take a time machine and visit here, that would be one of the things that I think it would really confound them. They'd be like, wait, you think you're an individual who can make things happen by decisions that you make on your own? Is that right? But to us, that's like, well, of course I can. But to them, it'd be like,
hilarious.
Really? Because that was an innovative idea among humans. I mean, you can trace that stuff, and even like psychology and all that. I mean, when Augustine did the Confessions, one of the things that was kind of mind blowing, I think, for people about it was the way that he just wrote about himself and what was going on in his own mind and what he struggled with. It was just a different way of thinking and approaching existence, which then took off from there, and we got to Freud and all sorts of stuff,
Whatever will we do when we all discover the terrible truth? We're all part of a giant computer simulation.
Yes, that's right.
Free will.
As the Matrix has shown us clearly.
You should see this. There's a free will app that we can never get it to work right.
Yeah, but here's the thing. If we are like the Matrix says, I think they would have the computers that needed our energy or whatever would have set it up so that I could have as many steaks as I want without putting on weight. I think that is a sure sign that it is not a program from some computer that just wants my energy, because man, make it desserts are health conscious. Broccoli is fattening. Why not set it up that way? That would serve us way better, I think.
You're assuming that this person sitting atop the Matrix is a nice person as opposed to some rat bastard.
That's true.
Who's always trying to torment people.
He's not even human. I mean, for that matter. So
it's the worst kind of artificial intelligence.
That's right. Now, just to bring it back around for a moment to Christianity, although
yes, which is exactly that was my next question. So okay, let's bring it around. Let's bring this around.
The thing, I really feel like there's an easy argument that can be made from the Bible that
What question are you answering?
Yeah, that this God that it talks about is a God who's not controlled by us. God is a hyperobject in the sense, without a doubt, in my view, in the way that God is described in the Bible, right? But then, even with the disciples, one of the things I love about the Gospel of Mark is you read about the disciples and they so don't understand what Jesus is up to. They're constantly misunderstanding. They're constantly not getting it, and it's
hyperobject.
I mean, the way that the Bible, a lot of the Bible talks about Jesus is it's this guy that kind of breaks into our reality and then just kind of blows it all up, or at least turns it all upside down, and then leaves again. And just to track that, the funny thing is how much we as humans try to control that story, that message. I was just working this book I'm working on. I was working on a section. I started with this joke, which I don't think I've said on this podcast. If I have, you can edit this out. But it's the joke of this small town, not well educated pastor that's getting nervous about modern translations of the Bible. And so what he says to defend himself is, if the King James was good enough for the Apostle Paul, it's good enough for me. And what I love about that, it's a perfectly good if-then statement.
However, that kills, I bet.
That's right. But, the weird thing is there are people even today that still hold on to the King James as being the only valid English version of the Bible. But the funny thing is, if you go back to, say, the 600s, at that point, the only valid translation in the Western Church was the Latin translation of the Bible. If anybody tried to do an everyday language version, you'd get burned at the stake or in all sorts of trouble, right? But then you go further back and it's like, yeah, but it wasn't even written in Latin. So why would Latin be the language when it was written? The New Testament was written in Greek. So why wouldn't it be Greek? So you've got Greek, Latin, English, people trying to control which version and how it's read. But then by 500 AD, the Bible had already been translated in 500 different languages, before the Latin version, so it's just like all of this, to me, that story shows all of the human attempts to control this thing that is called Christianity, and to shut it down and say it's ours and we know how to do it. And if you don't do it our way, you're doing it wrong. And the other is, and if you don't do it the way we say you should do it, you're really going to mess this thing up. And it's kind of like, I just don't think that's true. I mean, history has shown that it'll show up in all sorts of places. I mean, where the biggest Presbyterian church today is in the world?
Somewhere in Africa, I'm guessing.
No, it is in South Korea, in Seoul, South Korea. Sure, I think it had at least a number of years ago, it had 60,000 members. I don't know how many now, but it's like, so what happened there? Was there some master plan by some Presbyterian that said, you know what, we're going to start this thing, in the United Kingdom and with some influence from Switzerland as well. Then we're going to move it along. And eventually our goal is to have a really big church in South Korea. That's what we're going to do. And it's like, no, nobody thought about that. Nobody imagined that. And it's this thing that's out of our control.
Why? I'm really curious. Christianity seems to do very well in Korea, in South Korea.
Yes. Which is funny because, I mean, it's almost ironic. I don't know. I don't want to overuse that word, but North Korea, it's like you can't possess a Bible. If you do, you get into some serious trouble. South Korea, you've got that one. You've got another one called Youngnak that is, again, this is a decade back or so, but it was over 100,000 members in Seoul back then. It was probably the largest in the world at that time. And it's like, wow, that's interesting. In South Korea, interesting, but then Japan, for example, Christianity, Japan has had a much tougher time than it has in South Korea. And in China, though people, in positions of power don't want to admit it, it's growing rapidly there. So
why do you suppose Japan has been a challenge, while South Korea has embraced Christianity with incredibly open arms?
I that's a great
what's
question.
The difference in those two cultures that makes Christianity appealing to one and unappealing to the other?
I will do a little research on that rather than speaking off of the top of my ignorance.
Yeah,
it's a great question. I think it's a really interesting one, because it's like, well, why does it work some places, not others? And also, the early church was a lot of the countries, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Libya, was the center of the church, during the time of the Roman Empire. And now it's a very tough place to be. And Islam is in those locations now and is the power there. But it's like, well, okay, so what happened there? How did that work? And why is it now, declining in the West? And then it's becoming so, such an important factor in Africa, which if you go early 1900s, I think we mentioned this recently, but it was Africa. Missionaries were like, oh, it's never going to really take off in that continent. There's just no way. And then it did, so.
I wonder if something about it being a hyperobject, that something in the nature of a hyperobject and Christianity as a hyperobject is perhaps, I'm wondering, is that what is impacting the way that Americans, let's just talk about this place, the way that Americans are perceiving Christianity?
Like give it a little more detail or more example on that. I think that's a good question.
What is it? As the American notion of what is Christianity is becoming incredibly diverse as America becomes diverse. And the original notion of America as a Christian nation was based on a very particular brand of Christianity, it's really not the brand that's being practiced in Africa today, a very different brand of Christianity. White European Christianity has a couple of interesting characteristics to it. It's incredibly dogmatic. And all right, and we've talked about dogma and what dogma, how dogma can be important, but how dogma can also be destructive. Does the creation of dogma, I'm just spitballing here and wondering out loud, is that part of the process where things become a hyperobject because in trying to make so many rules, we suddenly lose sight of what the object is itself? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think
that the concept of Christianity is not hard to grasp. It really, the core concepts aren't complicated. Do unto others, even the mustard seed ideal. These are simple ideals.
Or the Good Samaritan, like we spoke about.
The Good Samaritan, as we talked about in our last podcast. These are simple ideals. They don't demand any dogma, certainly, but they're simple ideals. How could those ideals become anything like a hyperobject or attached to a hyperobject? How can those things suddenly become hard to fathom?
Well, I think, in the really broad sense, what Christianity tends to do, which actually makes it different from a lot of other global religions, but it's highly translatable, meaning that it can engage any culture and both find a home, make its home in that culture, but also challenge the culture.
Yeah.
And because of that, it's passed on from one culture to another. And if you look at it in different times and different places, it's got different characteristics that aren't solely because of that culture, but are also because of the culture that it came from, that passed it on to them, right? So that's one of the things that so far you don't see as much in Islam, for example, because, the Quran can be translated, but really the Quran needs to be read in Arabic. It is in Arabic and it is connected to that culture and time and language. But really Christianity...
it demands to be read in Arabic, doesn't it?
Yeah, because...
you can read it in other languages, but you really must, in order to really read it, you must read it in the Arabic.
Yeah, the equivalence I got this from a guy that's a hero of mine, but the equivalence between Islam and Christianity is not the Bible and the Quran, it's Jesus and the Quran. And what he means by that is Jesus is what is taken into different cultures, and then the Bible's translated and to that language and concepts and all that, no problem. That's part of, broadly speaking, no problem. There are definitely times where that is a problem, but the idea of it is that. So the dogmatic part of it that you're talking about in the Western church, I think you can trace that back to actually it's my folks that caused a lot of that to develop in Christianity. Because if you look at when a lot of the tribes and groups in the United Kingdom, what became the United Kingdom, started to become Christian, they were very law-based societies. And so one of the first things they would do when somebody decided the whole place was going to become Christian, because again, they didn't have the same concept of individuals, so when key people decided you were Christian, everybody became Christian. But they started with their legal codes, and they started with the legal codes in the Bible and their legal codes and trying to map out, okay, now we're Christian, so what does that do to our legal codes? Right. And I think all of that really planted the seeds for like a discipline called systematic theology, which is an attempt to systematize and state in propositional truth forms the different categories of truth that come out of Christianity. But so it's a cultural approach to becoming Christian that I think has some pros. I mean, they worked through some issues that people were like, wait, how does this work with this work? And it's like, oh, well, we need to figure this out. So there's some good stuff there, but there was also a loss of Christianity as a hyperobject, to use our term, because it started to become a set of principles and beliefs and things that you need to agree with in your mind to be a Christian. But even Jesus' statement was, I am the way, the truth, and the life, which is an interesting statement because a person is the truth. Isn't it just a set of, isn't it like 10 commandments? Isn't that the truth? But Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. But we kind of lost that in the Western church in some ways because of the way we were working, we were developing it according to our culture. Now, I think in Africa...
Well, the church kind of replaced Jesus as the core principle.
See, and that is the trouble with institutionalized religion in terms of Christianity, even going back to Jesus and the institutional Jewish faith of the day. There were all sorts of clashes. If you look at what the stuff of the clashes between Jesus and the institutional leaders of his day were, it was similar. It was the institution became more important than, the way that it's described in the Gospels. It's like Jesus heals somebody on the Sabbath and the leaders get ticked off because he did it on the Sabbath. It's not like, oh my gosh, there's a guy that's like healing people here. It was more like he did that on the Sabbath, so it was this same, it was the same institution. It was the institution, and its maintenance became the thing. And so in this sense, I think you lost the possibility of a hyperobject, because I think by definition, again, hyperobjects are things that we don't control. So, if something shows up that doesn't fit within our schema, we want to reject it. But what I love about this concept of hyperobject is it's kind of like, guess what? We don't know everything. Guess what? We're not in control of everything. Guess what? There may be things that show up. I remember when people started thinking, at least in my circles, this kind of question of, what if we did find another planet that was inhabited? And their fear was that it would blow their whole faith away. And to me, it's like, why? And let's deal with that when we run into it. But why would that automatically mean
their faith becomes a hyperobject in that sense? Because
who knows what they would believe? And what if on this other planet, they had beliefs that we actually found some commonality in, and we're like, oh, wait a minute, maybe there's something bigger going. That's just as much of a possibility in my mind as we see them and they're like, they have no concept of God, no concept of anything spiritual, and we just feel like, oh no, I don't know. It's just
that actually is a fascinating proposition as a concept, that we would find creatures on another planet, and rather than they have all the answers, they're searching as intensely for the answers as we are.
Exactly. I mean, and because we do have we're all caught up in this hyper object, I guess you could call it, of the universe. And there are, yes, lots of things would change on a different planet according to, a million different things. But at the same time, if there's sentient beings that find themselves in this universe, then they're certainly going to be asking some of the same questions that we've asked. And there would be a space for, I think, some really interesting conversations and discussions, I mean, so to me, it's like, again, I don't feel like I have to control my faith or control, it has a shape. I mean, I'm not saying it's shapeless, formless, and it can be anything. What was it? I think it was Sam Harris had some joke, I think, about, what is it? What's the difference between a Jehovah's Witness and a, oh my gosh, I'm going to forget the other church, a Unitarian. What's the difference between a Jehovah's Witness and a Unitarian? If a Unitarian knocks on your door, he wouldn't have anything to tell you. So I thought that was pretty funny. So I probably didn't tell it right, but it's this, it's this idea that, to me, it's not shapeless, formless.
It worked for me.
Thank you. It's one of these, I'm falling into the world of dad jokes. I get these sad looks from my boys when I try a joke, and it's like, well, all right, at least I get the mercy laugh, that sort of thing. But the idea being that, I still got a definite shape, direction, focus, to my faith, but I don't have to control it because it's way bigger than I am. And that actually means I can enjoy the mystery and the awe and questions and thinking, oh, I don't have a good answer for that one. I don't know. Can't wait to explore that and see what happens. And that, to me, it's the same with, with climate or even the pandemic, is I think this kind of an approach where we're not trying to immediately control things. Yes, it's dangerous, but life is dangerous. And so you can either say, we're going to constantly try to keep danger as far as possible from us, which I just don't think develops good humans. Or we say, you know what, life is this crazy adventure and you don't know what's coming your way, but man, you got to be ready and go for it. I'd much prefer that approach.
There's indeed risk, and there's nothing wrong with the risk.
Not at all. I mean, that it simply is part of being a human that's limited in our power, our ability to understand, our senses. Things can happen to us, and stuff that, I love it when stuff happens and then you look back and you're like, I should have seen that, but I didn't see that at all. Random, but here's a great story I think you'll like. I was getting out of the shower one time and we hadn't put the shower rug down again. It was in the wash. So I stepped out on my heel, which wasn't intelligent, just totally wiped out, right? And I pulled down the shower curtain. I wrenched my shoulder. I hit my head.
Oh,
it was bad. But the worst part was that everything went totally black. And my first thought wasn't the pain of it was like, oh my gosh, I've given myself a concussion. But then as I sat there a minute and looked over, I realized that as I had reached out while I was falling, I just knocked off the light switch. So it was totally fine. I just thought I had a concussion. But to me, it's like, that's part of being human. It's crazy. It's silly. It was dumb to step out in the first place. What a ridiculous idea that I knocked myself out because it all went dark, but that's because we don't control everything. And you can actually find some humor and joy in approaching life that way, even though it's still dangerous. But,
Oh, certainly. I think there's a great lesson to be taken from the whole idea of hyperobjects.
Yeah. Yeah.
A tremendous, well, the whole thing that got him thinking was the need to think about these big things differently
Yes.
than we're thinking about them.
Yeah. I mean, what was it that caught your, your attention, this concept? What was it that really grabbed you as you were picking up on this?
Well, I'm always attracted to the idea of one, thinking outside the box, but also to toss the box.
Mm-hmm.
That part of the rut that we're in is we keep thinking about things the same way. What's that thing about
insanity? That one,
insanity. You keep doing the same thing again.
And expecting a different result, and it's kind of like, I think it's time to think differently here. This is not working for us. Yeah.
And as I've gone along on this path, 63 years now, what strikes me that the thing that gets in most people's way is they think about things poorly. Well, their analytical skills aren't very good, but then they frame things from a strange perspective. And so that as they begin to think about this thing, if it's a problem, then how to solve it, because they framed it so strangely to begin with, they're trying to solve the wrong problem.
See, that's why I like that joke about the King James thing, because it's just framed in a way that it's like you've just canceled out your whole point because of the way you've set it up. There's assumptions that you're making that aren't accurate, and that's messing everything up. And I feel like in so many ways we're doing that in the midst of all the change that's going on. And I'm not blaming us. I mean, the fact is life has changed so dramatically and so quickly for us as human beings that it's hard to find a frame that works. But I think we're latching on to frames. Some of them are from the 60s and some of them are for much earlier than that. And we're assuming, I'm going to see life out of this and it's going to work perfectly. And it's like, no, it's actually not, because the 60s and today, massive difference, So,
the thing that attracted me initially, as I said, was that it offered a way to explain why our solutions keep failing.
Yes. Okay. That's good.
Then with that in mind, I turn to us and why is Christianity failing in this country?
Yeah. And honestly, to me, it's because people are trying to control it according to their assumptions of what it needs to be, very particularly what it needs to look like and how you gather together and all of that. And it's a bunch of assumptions that I understand why we have those assumptions, but you're snuffing out, anybody that's even thinking about, there's this great one of Jesus's better cut downs.
Let me just toss this in.
Please go for it.
The mistake that they're making is that it's not so much that they're thinking of it wrong. They're thinking of it too small.
Yes, definitely.
And that's what makes a hyperobject a hyperobject. It's bigger than you think.
Yes. And that, that's what worship, for example, is supposed to be about, is that you're engaging this thing that's much greater than you are, a personal, being that is greater than you. And so you're coming in to, sing to, pray to, celebrate with this larger thing. But so often we can manage to take even that and make it about, wait, you didn't do this the right way. You forgot this or whatever. I remember one time when I was at Silver Lake and I thought, hey, this would be a good idea. Why don't we, instead of me doing a sermon, we're going to have an extended prayer time. And I had a way to do it that would make it interactive and interesting. So we did that. I thought it went pretty well, but as I was shaking people's hands afterwards, this lady came up to me and she said, I came to hear a sermon and you didn't even preach, and it was just like, okay, I'm sorry. I will do that most of the time, but do you realize why we're gathered here? We're not gathered here for you to have your needs met, although hopefully that happens, but that's not the goal, but it's so to me, that's again, a practical
for a show, damn it.
Yeah, exactly. This is like, the idea is that you're coming to engage something that's way bigger than you are, which means you're not in control, which means be ready for whatever's going to happen, but don't like have a locked in way it has to occur and get ticked off if you don't get it. I mean, what's that,
Let's close on this. When you finally sparked to the idea of hyperobjects, you really sparked to it.
Yeah.
What sparked?
It's related in a way to what you said about finding new solutions, or a way to talk about, because I feel too, like we have a lot of bad ideas. We're trying to implement them yet again. They haven't worked well, but then we also have kind of this way of seeing ourselves in the world that's really small. And I know that the answers are out there. I mean, I know that, like with climate change and with the new fuels and stuff, give us enough time, we're going to figure it out. We are going to figure it out. Now how much the price we have to pay may be fairly dear, just because innovation takes time. But this idea of, well, look, we've got a huge challenge ahead. We're probably already going to suffer some consequences, but what should we do? One would be, how do we help people that are living at lower levels, with the sea level issues? How do we, in a way, loving our neighbor as ourselves, how do we help them relocate or deal with it, or put up? How do we deal with that while we're also innovating, trying to get these new energy sources to work, but not in a way that's like, stop oil now, which then means a whole bunch of people, especially the poor, get really hurt because we haven't replaced it with anything. It's like, replace the thing as fast as possible. So it, to me, and definitely with Christianity, I've always felt like Christianity, my faith has always encouraged me to think out of the box. It's never been about climbing in a box. And I know other people do experience faith as a box you can climb into and be safe. And there's a time for that, but that's not what Christianity is. Christianity is much more about open your mind to a greater reality than anything you know or expected to know. But when you do that, I mean, life becomes an adventure. I mean, it makes life really fun. But when you're like holding so tightly, it's like, of course, people are angry, upset, cynical, mad, beat their spouses, whatever, because it's like, who wants to live in that kind of a world, but that's not the world we live in. And so it just all, to me, it was pointing in the right direction to being able to think in fresh, new, innovative ways. And I'm always excited about that. I really don't like when people try to control thought. I love when people are opening the doors to innovation that'll move us forward. And I think
I think you've just opened my eyes, Randy, to the fact that life might be the ultimate hyperobject.
Amen to that. Yes. 100%.
And on that bombshell.
We're going to count who gets how many bombshells, but I think you're way ahead. I think your batting average is much better than mine. I've got to work on my bombshell.
I'm always looking for it.
I'm telling you, that's this whole world that you're in of writing and scripts and all that. I think it just, you phrase things well. You put them together well. I'm a preacher. I talk about them for 45 minutes when I should have just talked about them for 22 minutes, but you've got a way to just boom, hey, that was a good one, let's go with that. So love it.
I've always had to work inside a schedule. The episode can only be this long, dude.
Yes.
Start cutting now.
And that's so hard. Oh man, that is so hard to do.
It's a whole discipline unto itself, but that's another conversation.
And how much have you left on the editing room floor? How many really good ideas, that you have to leave on the floor and you're like, oh man, that would have been good, but you have to let it go if you're going to.
Don't get me started.
Yeah, we should talk about editing sometime.
Well, yes. Hey, editing is the name of the game. You know,
Yeah.
I don't know why we call it writing. We should just cut to the chase and call it rewriting, because that's really what it is.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. Yeah. All right, man.
Thank
Great
you, everybody,
conversation.
for joining us.